Have you ever smiled while someone destroyed your reputation in front of an entire room? Not because it was funny, not because it didn't hurt, but because you were simply too exhausted to defend yourself anymore. Imagine standing at your own son's wedding, surrounded by people dressed in their finest clothes, listening to music, watching everyone celebrate love, and then your own sister raises her glass, points toward you with a smile, and introduces you as the unemployed one who lives off the family. The laughter is polite. The silence that follows is not. Every eye in the room turns toward you. Some people look uncomfortable. Others look curious. A few silently judge. You force yourself to smile because you've learned something life never teaches in school. Sometimes dignity is quieter than revenge. But what nobody in that reception hall knew, not my sister, not my son, not even the CEO she was desperately trying to impress, was that the man standing beside her had spent the last 3 years searching for me. Not because I owed him money. Not because I had disappeared after some scandal, because I had walked away from a career that most executives spend their entire lives chasing, and he had never understood why. By the end of that wedding, one sentence would expose everything. One quiet truth would destroy years of lies, and my sister would finally understand that the strongest people in a room are rarely the loudest ones. My name is Melanie Sinclair. I'm 46 years old. 3 years ago, people introduced me very differently. Back then, I wasn't standing quietly near the coat check. I wasn't avoiding conversations. I wasn't pretending not to hear whispered comments. Back then, I walked into boardrooms where million-dollar decisions waited for my opinion. Companies fought over my time. Executives postponed meetings until I arrived. My presentations decided mergers. My strategies changed industries. I had built every inch of that career myself. No wealthy parents. No family connections. No shortcuts. Every promotion came from years of impossible hours, impossible pressure, and impossible expectations. People loved using one particular phrase whenever they introduced me. Self-made. At the time, I believed them. I believed my career was proof of my worth. I believed success could protect you from being forgotten. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because life has a strange habit of asking one impossible question. What happens when everything that made people admire you suddenly disappears? Mine happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was standing inside a glass conference room nearly 40 floors above the city. Outside the windows, the skyline stretched forever. Inside the room, 12 senior partners were discussing my future. After 20 years of work, I was only days away from becoming managing partner, the biggest promotion of my career. The position I'd sacrificed birthdays, vacations, relationships, entire pieces of my life to reach. Then my phone vibrated. Mom. Normally, I would have ignored it. She knew never to call during meetings, which meant something was wrong. I quietly excused myself and stepped into the hallway. I answered. I expected to hear an apology. Instead, I heard fear. Real fear. My doctor called. Her voice shook. They found something. There are certain words that split your life into 2 parts. Before and after. She only needed 2. Pancreatic cancer. Then another. Stage 4. Everything around me disappeared. The hallway. The city. The meeting. The promotion. None of it mattered anymore. The doctors weren't talking about years. They were talking about months. Maybe less. I leaned against the glass wall trying to breathe, while thousands of people hurried through the streets far below. Cars kept moving. Meetings kept happening. Coffee shops stayed full. The world continued exactly as it always had. Only mine had stopped for a long moment. I did nothing. Then I asked my mother the only question that mattered. What do you need? She hesitated. I don't want to ruin your career. Those words hurt more than the diagnosis. Even now, a dying mother was worrying about becoming an inconvenience. I closed my eyes. My entire career suddenly felt unbelievably small. Success had spent 20 years convincing me that deadlines couldn't wait. Cancer disagreed. I returned to the conference room. The partners looked up. Some smiled. They assumed I had good news. Instead, I quietly gathered my notebook. One partner frowned. Everything all right? I nodded once. No, my mother is dying. Silence. I won't be accepting the promotion. Confusion spread around the table. Someone actually asked, "Are you sure you want to make such a permanent decision?" I looked at him. Then I looked around the room I'd spent 2 decades trying to conquer. Finally, I understood something. There will always be another meeting, another promotion, another quarter. There will never be another mother. I walked away that day without looking back. At least that's what everyone thought. The truth is, walking away from success is easy. Living with what comes afterward, that's the part nobody prepares you for. People love to celebrate sacrifice until they realize they're the ones expected to make it. The very night I walked away from the biggest promotion of my life, I called my younger sister, Sandra. I wasn't calling to make her feel guilty. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I simply believed that family would face this together. She answered on the second ring. At first, she sounded shocked by Mom's diagnosis. She cried. She kept saying, "This can't be happening." For a few moments, I felt relieved. Maybe we would share the burden. Maybe neither of us would have to carry it alone. But when the conversation turned toward reality, everything changed. "One of us is going to have to stay with Mom," I said quietly. There was a long silence, long enough for me to already know the answer. Finally, Sandra sighed. "Mel, I just can't. I've worked too hard to get where I am. If I step away now, someone else will take my place. My career will be over." She spoke quickly, almost as if she'd rehearsed those sentences before I even called. At that moment, I didn't judge her. I understood exactly what she meant, because only a few hours earlier, I had walked away from everything she was trying so desperately to protect. "I'll do it," I said. There wasn't any drama, no argument, no guilt, just 4 simple words. "I'll take care of Mom." Sandra immediately sounded relieved. Too relieved. She thanked me several times. She called me brave. She called me selfless. She even promised, "We'll get through this together." Looking back now, that was the first promise she never intended to keep. People often imagine caregiving as a series of emotional moments, holding someone's hand, sharing meaningful conversations, saying goodbye. Sometimes those moments happen. Most of the time, caregiving is something much quieter. It's waking up before sunrise, because medications have to be given at exactly 6. It's learning medical words you never wanted to know. It's memorizing treatment schedules instead of birthdays. It's sitting for hours in waiting rooms where clocks seem to stop moving. Within weeks, hospitals became more familiar to me than my own home. I knew which elevators were fastest, which nurses smiled even after 12-hour shifts, which cafeteria served edible coffee, which parking spaces emptied first after chemotherapy appointments. My world became astonishingly small. Morning hospital, pharmacy, home, repeat, every single day. Meanwhile, the world I had once dominated quietly moved on without me. At first, colleagues still called. They asked how my mother was doing. They promised to stay in touch. They told me there would always be opportunities when I came back. Then the calls became weekly, then monthly. Eventually, they stopped completely. Emails disappeared. Invitations ended. My phone, once filled with meetings and deadlines, became almost silent. It was strange. For 20 years, people had insisted they couldn't do business without me. Turns out, they could. The business world replaces people much faster than people replace family. That lesson hurt, but not nearly as much as watching my mother slowly disappear. Some mornings, she looked almost normal. She'd smile. She'd joke about how terrible hospital food was. We'd drink coffee together and pretend life hadn't changed. Those mornings gave me hope. By evening, the pain usually returned, and hope quietly packed its bags again. One afternoon, after another exhausting treatment, Mom looked at me and asked something I wasn't prepared to answer. "Do you miss your old life?" I smiled automatically. "No." She kept looking at me. "Mothers always know when you're lying." "You do," she whispered. "And that's okay." Tears filled my eyes, because I did miss it. Not the money, not the title, not even the office. I missed feeling useful. I missed walking into a room where people listened when I spoke. I missed being someone the world considered important. Mom reached for my hand. Her fingers had become so thin, so fragile. "Melanie, they'll judge you by the room you're standing in." She paused to catch her breath. "Don't ever judge yourself the same way." I laughed softly. "You're becoming philosophical." She smiled. "I'm becoming honest." Neither of us knew it then, but those words would become the most valuable inheritance she would ever leave me. Money slowly became another problem. Cancer doesn't only attack the body, it attacks savings, retirement plans, dreams, security. One bill became 5. 5 became 50. I sold my apartment, packed away 20 years of memories, moved into a much smaller place. Friends assumed I had made bad financial decisions. No one asked why. People rarely ask questions when assumptions are easier. Sandra visited occasionally, usually for an hour or two. She always arrived wearing expensive clothes and talking about promotions. She'd kiss Mom on the forehead, bring flowers, stay just long enough for photographs. Then she'd leave before the difficult hours began. She never stayed for the nights. She never stayed when Mom cried from the pain. She never stayed when treatments made her too weak to stand. Those parts belonged to me. And strangely, I still didn't resent her. Not yet, because I kept believing that someday she'd understand what these moments were worth. I was wrong, very wrong. The hardest betrayal isn't when someone refuses to help. It's when they later pretend your sacrifice was never valuable in the first place. And that realization was still waiting for me, along with the most painful day of my life, my mother's final goodbye. People think grief ends at a funeral. It doesn't. The funeral is simply the day everyone else goes home. You're the one who stays behind. You're the one who walks into an empty house that still smells like the person you lost. You're the one who reaches for your phone to call them, before remembering there will never be another answer. For nearly 2 years, my life had revolved around one mission: keeping my mother comfortable. Now, that mission was over. One quiet spring morning, she took her final breath while I was holding her hand. There were no dramatic last words, no movie-style speeches, just one long breath, then silence. The kind of silence that changes your life forever. I sat there for several minutes without moving. I wasn't crying, not because I wasn't heartbroken, because I couldn't yet believe the world had continued turning without her. The nurse gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," I nodded. Those were the first words anyone had spoken in what felt like an entirely different lifetime. The funeral was beautiful. White flowers, soft music, friends, neighbors, family members I hadn't seen in years. Everyone came to honor my mother. Or at least, that's what I believed. People hugged me. They told me how strong I was, how lucky my mother had been to have me. For a little while, I actually felt seen. Then something strange started happening. Conversation after conversation slowly shifted away from my mother and toward me. An aunt squeezed my arm. "It's such a shame." I looked at her. "What is?" "Everything you gave up. You used to have such an incredible career." Used to. 2 words. That's all it took. I wasn't standing there as the daughter who had spent 2 years caring for her dying mother. I had already become the woman who used to be somebody. Every conversation seemed to carry the same hidden message. Poor Melanie. Such wasted potential. Maybe she'll get back on her feet someday. Back on my feet? I wanted to laugh. I'd just spent 2 years carrying another human being. I'd never been stronger. Yet somehow, the world saw me as broken. Sandra arrived looking absolutely perfect. Elegant black dress. Perfect makeup. Perfect hair. Perfect timing. She cried beautifully. The kind of crying people immediately. Within an hour, relatives surrounded her, telling her how sorry they were, how difficult this must be. I watched from across the room while quietly collecting casserole dishes and signing paperwork. It was oddly familiar. I'd done the difficult work. She received the visible sympathy. By the end of the afternoon, the family story had already begun changing. One cousin told another, "Sandra has been so worried about Melanie." Another added, "I hope she finds herself again." Find myself? I knew exactly where I'd been. Every hospital room, every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night. The only people who thought I'd been lost were the ones who had never bothered to look. That evening, I stood alone in Mom's kitchen. The house was finally quiet. The flowers were beginning to wilt. Half-eaten casseroles filled the refrigerator. Thank you cards covered the table. I looked around the room where Mom and I had laughed, cried, prayed, and said goodbye. Then I realized something that hurt even more than losing her. People only remember the sacrifices they can see. The invisible ones disappear astonishingly fast. The promotions you decline, the opportunities you surrender, the dreams you quietly bury. None of those leave photographs. So eventually, people forget they ever happened. Sandra wasn't forgetting. She was rewriting. Slowly, patiently, conversation by conversation. She never lied outright. That was what made it so effective. She simply told incomplete truths. Mel hasn't worked in years. Technically true. She's still figuring things out. Also true. She's between jobs. True again. What she never mentioned was why. Because the truth would have made her look too small, and she'd spent her entire life trying to look bigger. Months passed. Then almost a year. Life became strangely quiet. The hospital routine disappeared. I no longer woke up at 6 for medications. No chemotherapy appointments. No emergency phone calls. Just silence. At first, that silence felt peaceful. Eventually, it became lonely. Some mornings I found myself waking up with nowhere I absolutely had to be. I wasn't anyone's caregiver anymore. I wasn't anyone's executive. I wasn't anyone's manager. I wasn't anyone's strategy director. I simply existed. It was the hardest identity I'd ever had. Then one afternoon my phone rang. It was my son, Ethan. The moment I heard his voice, I smiled. No matter how difficult life became, he had always been my greatest joy. "Mom, I have some news." I could hear excitement, nervousness, hope. "I'm getting married." For the first time in months, I cried happy tears. He told me everything. Her name was Claire, kind, smart, patient, the kind of woman who made him better simply by loving him. As he spoke, I could hear something I'd missed for a long time: the future. For the first time since losing Mom, life wasn't asking me to say goodbye. It was inviting me to celebrate again. Then, near the end of the conversation, his voice changed. He hesitated. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Of course, there was another long pause. "Aunt Sandra's going to be there. And, can you please not argue with her?" My heart sank, not because of what he asked, because of what it meant. My own son believed I was the one who might create a problem. Not the sister who constantly mocked me, the sister who might finally respond. He wasn't choosing sides. He was protecting his wedding. I understood that. Still, it hurt more than I expected. I smiled anyway. "I promise. For you, I'll stay quiet." He thanked me with obvious relief. After we hung up, I sat alone for a very long time. Then one small detail from our conversation came back to me. "So where are you working now?" He answered proudly. "Meridian Strategy Group." The name hit me like an old memory. Meridian, one of the biggest consulting firms in the country. A company I had competed against for years. A company that had quietly adopted many of the strategic ideas I'd helped pioneer. I smiled to myself. What a coincidence. Little did I know that one company, one wedding, and one powerful CEO were about to change every single life in that family forever. Because my sister believed she was bringing me to a wedding, when in reality, she was walking me toward the biggest truth she'd spent years trying to hide. The rehearsal dinner took place the night before the wedding. It was held at a beautiful private restaurant overlooking a vineyard. Everything about the evening looked expensive without trying to. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Soft piano music floated through the room. Crystal glasses caught the warm light. Even the waiters moved with the quiet confidence of people who worked where mistakes almost never happened. It was exactly the kind of place where appearances mattered, and no one cared more about appearances than my sister. Sandra arrived nearly 20 minutes late, not because she had to, because arriving late guaranteed everyone would notice. She walked into the room wearing a designer dress, an expensive watch, and the kind of smile that said she believed she belonged above everyone else. Within minutes, she had become the center of attention. She laughed loudly. She greeted everyone by name. She complimented people just enough to make them like her. It was a performance, a very polished one. I'd watched it my entire life. From across the room, I simply observed. Funny enough, losing everything had made me a much better observer. When you're no longer competing for attention, you start seeing people exactly as they are. Sandra wasn't enjoying the evening. She was managing it. Every conversation was calculated. Every compliment had a purpose. Every laugh was measured. She wasn't talking to people. She was collecting them. I sat quietly near one end of the table with a glass of wine. Nobody ignored me completely. People were polite. They smiled. They asked safe questions. But I could feel the difference. Years ago, people would have gathered around me asking about business, leadership, and global markets. Now, they asked whether I enjoyed gardening, whether retirement suited me, whether I had considered volunteering somewhere. Retirement. I wasn't even 50. Still, I smiled. Correcting people had become exhausting. Claire's parents were genuinely kind. There was nothing fake about them. They simply didn't know my story. How could they? Sandra had already written it for them. To them, I was Ethan's mother. A pleasant woman who had once had a career, someone whose best years had quietly passed no one, meant to insult me. They simply believed the version they'd been given. That realization hurt more than intentional cruelty ever could. As dinner continued, one name kept appearing in Sandra's conversation. David, my CEO. David loved my presentation. David expects excellence. David says, she spoke his name almost reverently. Anyone listening would think they worked side by side every day. I noticed Ethan listening with admiration. He clearly respected the man. And Sandra knew it. Every mention of David elevated her importance just a little more. I finally asked Ethan quietly, so, your CEO is coming tomorrow? He smiled proudly. Yeah, he doesn't usually attend employee weddings. I still can't believe he accepted. Sandra overheard immediately. She couldn't resist adding more. David only attends events that matter. She smiled at me before taking another sip of wine. It's amazing what happens when people actually contribute something valuable. A few people laughed politely. Others looked uncomfortable. I simply continued eating. Silence can be incredibly frustrating to someone hoping for a fight. During the salad course, Claire's mother turned toward me with genuine curiosity. So, Melanie, what do you do? It was such a simple question. An honest one. For a second, I almost answered. I almost told her everything. About my mother. About the hospitals. About leaving the partnership. About learning that love sometimes costs more than success ever can. But before I spoke, Sandra answered for me. Oh, Mel's between things. She laughed lightly. She's been between things for quite a while now. The words were soft, almost affectionate. That was what made them so cruel. If she'd been openly insulting, people would have defended me. Instead, she wrapped humiliation inside kindness. No one knew whether to react. Claire's mother smiled awkwardly. Oh, I'm sorry. I smiled back. Don't be. But inside, something shifted. Not anger, not embarrassment, clarity. I suddenly realized Sandra wasn't trying to describe my life. She was trying to define it. And there is an enormous difference between the two. Dinner continued. Stories, laughter, champagne, music. But my appetite had disappeared. After the main course, I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the vineyard. The evening air was cool. Rows of grapevines stretched into the distance beneath hundreds of tiny lights. For the first time all night, I could breathe. A few moments later, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Claire. She stood beside me without saying anything. Sometimes silence is the greatest form of respect. Finally, she spoke. Ethan told me you cared for your mom. I nodded. For almost 2 years. She looked at me with genuine compassion. That must have been incredibly difficult. No one had asked me that question in 3 years. Not one person. Everyone had asked what I'd lost. No one had asked what I'd given. I told her about the early morning hospital drives, the endless treatments, the night sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, the small victories, the impossible goodbyes. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she quietly said something I'll never forget. That's not a gap in your life. That's probably the most meaningful thing you'll ever do. I looked away toward the vineyard because suddenly my eyes burned. She had returned something to me the world had slowly stolen. Respect. Not for my career, for my choices. For the first time in years, someone saw me. Not my resume, not my unemployment. Me. When we returned inside, Sandra was entertaining another group of guests. Her laughter echoed across the room. She glanced toward us. For just a second, our eyes met. She saw Claire standing beside me. She saw us smiling. And something changed in her expression. People like Sandra don't simply want attention. They want comparison. If someone else begins receiving quiet respect, they immediately feel they're losing something. I could almost see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She needed another moment, another reminder, another way to place me beneath her. I didn't know how she planned to do it. But after 46 years of being her sister, I knew it was coming. And unfortunately, I was right. Dessert had just been served when Claire's father casually mentioned that he might someday need strategic advice for his company. He wasn't making an offer. He was simply thinking out loud. Sandra reacted instantly, like someone hearing an opportunity knock. She reached confidently into her designer handbag, pulled out a stack of elegant navy blue business cards, smiled proudly, and spread them across the white tablecloth. Please, if you ever need anything, I'd be happy to help. Then, very slowly, she turned toward me. The smile never left her face. Mel, she paused just long enough for everyone to notice. Do you have a business card? The room became silent, not because of the question, because everyone understood what she was really asking. She wasn't asking whether I carried cards. She was asking, do you still matter? I looked down at the beautiful cards lying across the table. 3 years earlier, I had owned thousands of them. Today, I didn't have one. I smiled gently. No, I'm afraid I don't. Sandra leaned back with quiet satisfaction. Exactly the reaction she'd hoped for. Conversation slowly resumed. Dessert arrived. People laughed again. But I noticed something strange. Across the table, Claire's father wasn't looking at Sandra's cards. He was looking at me, almost as though he sensed there was a story no one had bothered to ask about. That night, back in my apartment, I stood in front of my closet for several minutes. Then I reached up to the highest shelf, pulled down an old storage box, and opened a chapter of my life I hadn't touched in years. Inside that box wasn't a resume, or awards, or business contracts. It was something far more valuable, a single photograph. And that photograph would quietly remind me of who I had been, just hours before the most powerful man at my son's wedding recognized me before anyone else did. The wedding day arrived beneath a clear blue sky. Music drifted through the gardens as guests gathered in elegant rows of white chairs. Flowers lined the aisle. Families smiled for photographs. Children ran across the lawn without a care in the world. Everything looked perfect, and for Ethan, it truly was. Watching my son stand at the altar, waiting for the woman he loved, reminded me that life always finds a way to begin again, even after unimaginable loss. For a little while, I forgot about Sandra. I forgot about the whispers. I forgot about everything except the quiet pride of watching my son become the kind of man his grandmother would have admired. The ceremony was beautiful, simple, honest, filled with laughter, tears, and promises that felt real. When the officiant announced them husband and wife, the applause echoed across the gardens. For one brief moment, everyone was simply happy. The reception began an hour later inside the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light. A live band played softly while guests found their seats. Servers moved gracefully between tables. Everything had been planned perfectly. Then, the room suddenly became quieter. People near the entrance stood up. Heads turned. Whispers spread from one table to another. He's here. The CEO. That's David Mercer. Sandra immediately straightened her posture. She checked her hair in the reflection of a nearby window, adjusted her necklace, smoothed her dress, then hurried toward the entrance, wearing the biggest smile I'd seen all weekend. She greeted him enthusiastically. David, I'm so honored you came. He smiled politely, shook her hand, thanked her. But almost immediately, his attention drifted past her. His eyes scanned the room, searching, looking for someone. Sandra continued talking, explaining where everyone was seated, pointing toward the bride and groom. David nodded politely, but he clearly wasn't listening anymore. Then, his eyes stopped. On me. For several seconds, he simply stared, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he began walking, not toward the head table, not toward Ethan, not toward Sandra, toward me. The room slowly fell silent again. Sandra looked confused. So did everyone else. David stopped directly in front of me. His face broke into a genuine smile, one I hadn't seen in years. Melanie Sinclair, I've been trying to find you. The ballroom became completely still. I smiled. It's been a long time. He laughed softly. Far too long. Without hesitation, he reached forward and embraced me. Not the polite handshake of two former colleagues. A real embrace. The kind reserved for people whose absence genuinely mattered. Around us, no one spoke. Sandra looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. David stepped back and shook his head. I can't believe it's really you. I called your old office. They told me you'd retired. I contacted recruiters. They had no idea where you'd gone. I even asked former clients if they'd heard from you. He smiled. You vanished. I looked down for a moment. My mother became ill. His expression immediately softened. I heard rumors. I never knew the truth. I walked away to care for her. For several seconds, he said nothing, then quietly replied, that explains everything. He looked around the room before speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. You know, half the strategic systems our industry uses today were inspired by Melanie. When people praise my leadership, they're often praising ideas I first learned from her. The silence became almost overwhelming. People stared at me with completely different eyes. Not because I had suddenly changed, because the story they believed had. Sandra finally forced a nervous laugh. Oh, David, I didn't realize you two knew each other. He turned toward her. His smile disappeared. Knew each other? He looked genuinely surprised. Sandra, Melanie wasn't just someone I knew. She was one of the finest strategic minds I've ever worked with. Have you ever smiled while someone destroyed your reputation in front of an entire room? Not because it was funny, not because it didn't hurt, but because you were simply too exhausted to defend yourself anymore. Imagine standing at your own son's wedding, surrounded by people dressed in their finest clothes, listening to music, watching everyone celebrate love, and then your own sister raises her glass, points toward you with a smile, and introduces you as the unemployed one who lives off the family. The laughter is polite. The silence that follows is not. Every eye in the room turns toward you. Some people look uncomfortable. Others look curious. A few silently judge. You force yourself to smile because you've learned something life never teaches in school. Sometimes dignity is quieter than revenge. But what nobody in that reception hall knew, not my sister, not my son, not even the CEO she was desperately trying to impress, was that the man standing beside her had spent the last 3 years searching for me. Not because I owed him money, not because I had disappeared after some scandal, because I had walked away from a career that most executives spend their entire lives chasing, and he had never understood why. By the end of that wedding, one sentence would expose everything. One quiet truth would destroy years of lies, and my sister would finally understand that the strongest people in a room are rarely the loudest ones. My name is Melanie Sinclair. I'm 46 years old. 3 years ago, people introduced me very differently. Back then, I wasn't standing quietly near the coat check. I wasn't avoiding conversations. I wasn't pretending not to hear whispered comments. Back then, I walked into boardrooms where million-dollar decisions waited for my opinion. Companies fought over my time. Executives postponed meetings until I arrived. Have you ever smiled while someone destroyed your reputation in front of an entire room? Not because it was funny, not because it didn't hurt, but because you were simply too exhausted to defend yourself anymore. Imagine standing at your own son's wedding, surrounded by people dressed in their finest clothes, listening to music, watching everyone celebrate love, and then your own sister raises her glass, points toward you with a smile, and introduces you as the unemployed one who lives off the family. The laughter is polite. The silence that follows is not. Every eye in the room turns toward you. Some people look uncomfortable. Others look curious. A few silently judge. You force yourself to smile because you've learned something life never teaches in school. Sometimes dignity is quieter than revenge. But what nobody in that reception hall knew, not my sister, not my son, not even the CEO she was desperately trying to impress, was that the man standing beside her had spent the last 3 years searching for me. Not because I owed him money. Not because I had disappeared after some scandal, because I had walked away from a career that most executives spend their entire lives chasing, and he had never understood why. By the end of that wedding, one sentence would expose everything. One quiet truth would destroy years of lies, and my sister would finally understand that the strongest people in a room are rarely the loudest ones. My name is Melanie Sinclair. I'm 46 years old. 3 years ago, people introduced me very differently. Back then, I wasn't standing quietly near the coat check. I wasn't avoiding conversations. I wasn't pretending not to hear whispered comments. Back then, I walked into boardrooms where million-dollar decisions waited for my opinion. Companies fought over my time. Executives postponed meetings until I arrived.